In 1923, a Pittsburgh streetcar conductor named Oswald deposited $11 into a passbook account and made a promise to himself he would keep for the next 40 years. He never broke it once. When he died in 1968, that promise had quietly turned into a fortune large enough to put 3 grandchildren through college and leave a paid-off house behind. The discipline he used has a name, and it was once taught to every American child before they turned 10. Then, somewhere in the 1970s, it vanished from the culture. Almost overnight. Banks did not want you practicing it anymore. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button, because what your great-grandparents understood about money was worth more than any app on your phone today. The discipline was called paying yourself first, and the people who built America's working-class fortunes treated it like a law of nature rather than a suggestion. The idea was almost insultingly simple. Before you paid the rent, before you bought groceries, before a single dollar went anywhere else, you took a fixed portion of every paycheck and put it somewhere you could not easily reach. 10% was the standard your grandfather would have recognized. Some families pushed it to 15 or 20 when times were good. The money came off the top, not the bottom, and that single reversal of order is the entire secret. Modern Americans save whatever happens to be left at the end of the month, which is almost always nothing. The Depression generation saved first and lived on what remained, and they lived just fine. George Clason captured this in 1926 in a slim book called The Richest Man in Babylon, which sold through working-class households the way a good Bible did. The lesson buried in its fables was that a part of all you earn is yours to keep. It sounds obvious until you realize that almost nobody actually does it. The money you earn feels like it belongs to you, but the moment it lands in your account, the landlord, the grocer, the utility company, and the car dealer all have a claim on it before you do. Clason's insight was that you have to stand at the front of that line. You have to pay yourself before you pay the people who are counting on your forgetfulness. What made this discipline so powerful was not the amount. It was the automation of willpower. Your great-grandmother did not wake up each month and decide whether to save. The decision had already been made years earlier, and then never revisited. A streetcar conductor earning $30 a week did not feel rich setting aside $3 of them. But $3 a week, compounded across a working life, became something that would have stunned him if he could have seen it in advance. The genius was in removing the choice. A decision you have to make over and over is a decision you will eventually lose. A decision you make once and lock away is a decision that quietly wins for the rest of your life. The mechanism families used was the simplest thing imaginable: a bank passbook for a dedicated savings account, and the rule that the account only ever grew. You did not withdraw from it for a new coat or a broken furnace. That money was dead to you, sealed off, untouchable, and that untouchability was precisely what made it work. The savings rate in the United States through the 1940s and into the 1960s regularly sat above 10% of household income, sometimes climbing toward 12%. Today, it hovers around 4%, and household debt has swollen past $17 trillion. The difference is not that your great-grandparents earned more. They earned dramatically less. The difference is the order in which they spent it. Compound interest was the second half of the discipline, and the Depression generation understood it in their bones, in a way that modern schooling somehow fails to instill. They did not think of it as a formula. They thought of it as a snowball, money making money, and then that new money making money of its own. Albert Einstein supposedly called it the eighth wonder of the world, and whether or not he ever said those words, the math behind them is undeniable. $1 saved at age 25, left alone to compound at a modest rate, becomes far more by retirement than $1 saved at 45, even though the later saver might put away 3 times as much in raw dollars. Time does the heavy lifting. The early dollar works for decades. The late dollar barely gets started. This is the cruel arithmetic that the pay-yourself-first generation respected and that we have largely forgotten. They started early because their parents made them start early, and they let time do what time does. A young couple in 1950 who put away even a small fixed sum each month and never touched it would, by the standards of their old age, look almost wealthy compared to neighbors who earned identical wages and saved nothing. The neighbor with the new car and the fresh suit was usually the one drowning. The quiet couple in the old Ford, the ones who had been paying themselves first since their wedding, were the ones who owned things free and clear. First pattern break. Here is where things get interesting, because the discipline of paying yourself first was not just a personal habit. It was reinforced by an entire architecture of institutions designed to make saving the path of least resistance, institutions that have since been dismantled or quietly replaced with their opposite. Consider the Christmas Club account, which millions of American families swore by from the early 1900s through the 1970s. You walked into your local savings and loan and deposited a small, fixed amount every week into an account that was locked until the 1st of December. No withdrawals. By the holidays, you had a tidy sum waiting, enough for presents and a ham with money to spare. At its peak in the 1960s, more than 17 million Americans held these accounts. The interest was almost nothing. That was never the point. The point was the commitment device. Money you could not touch was money you could not spend. Banks eventually stopped offering the product because it cost them administrative overhead and earned them almost nothing, while the credit cards that replaced it earned billions. The Christmas Club worked too well for the customer and not well enough for the bank. So it disappeared, and a discipline that used to be handed to you on a printed schedule became something you now have to invent for yourself. War bonds operated on the same principle during the 1940s. The government let working families buy a bond for a fraction of its face value. $18.75 bought a bond that matured to $25. A payroll deduction plan meant the money came out before the worker ever saw it. More than 85 million Americans bought them. The campaign was framed as patriotism, but what it actually did was train an entire generation in the habit of automatic, off-the-top saving. Families discovered they never missed the money that vanished before it hit their hands. When the war ended, many simply kept the habit going, redirecting those automatic deductions into savings and bonds of their own. The discipline outlived the emergency that created it. The whole life insurance policy was the third pillar, and this one financial advisors will argue about until the sun burns out. But here is what actually happened in working-class households. A family bought a small policy, paid a fixed premium every single month without fail, and watched the cash value accumulate year after year, regardless of what the stock market did. That premium was a forced savings payment dressed up as protection. You could not skip it without consequences, which is exactly why it worked for people who knew they could not be trusted to save voluntarily. By middle age, that accumulated cash value was something to borrow against for a house, a business, an emergency. The families who held those old policies built private banking systems for themselves, one disciplined monthly payment at a time. Second pattern break. Now, here is something the financial industry would prefer you did not dwell on. Every one of these institutions had the same structure, and that structure is the thing modern finance has systematically inverted. The old system made saving automatic and spending effortful. You had to actively decide to break into your Christmas club, cash in your bond early, or surrender your policy. The friction protected you from yourself. The modern system has flipped this entirely. Saving now requires constant active effort, while spending has been engineered to be the path of least resistance. A credit card removes every speed bump between a desire and a purchase. Tap, and it is done. You feel nothing. Buy now, pay later. Splits a purchase into 4 painless installments, so that even the sting of the full price is hidden from you. Every innovation in consumer finance over the last 50 years has pointed in the same direction, toward making it easier to spend money you do not yet have, and harder to hold on to money you already earned. Your great-grandfather lived inside an architecture built to help him accumulate. You live inside an architecture built to help you consume. That is the real shift, and it explains why a man earning $30 a week could retire with a paid-off house, while people earning 10 times as much today retire with nothing. He was swimming downstream. You are swimming up. The discipline of paying yourself first is, in a very literal sense, the act of building your own private dam against a current that is now engineered to carry your money away from you. The Depression generation also understood something we have lost about the relationship between income and identity. They drew a hard line between what they earned and what they spent, and they kept the gap as wide as they could stand. A family bringing in $5,000 a year would deliberately arrange their entire life around $4,000. The missing $1,000 went into savings before a single bill was paid. They did this not because they were poor, but because they were strategic. They understood that visible wealth and actual wealth are two completely different things, and that the person flaunting prosperity is very often the person quietly drowning in payments to sustain the illusion. There is a phrase for what they practiced, though they would not have used it. They lived below their means on purpose, permanently, as a way of life rather than a temporary sacrifice. They wore clothes an extra season. They ate at home 6 nights a week. They drove the car until it genuinely could not be driven anymore. None of this was deprivation in their minds. It was simply the cost of the freedom they were buying, and the freedom was always the goal. The gap between what they earned and what they spent was not a hardship. It was the engine. It was the single thing that turned modest wages into real, durable, generational wealth. What strikes you, studying how these families actually lived, is how unglamorous the whole thing was. There was no secret investment, no insider knowledge, no clever scheme. There was a fixed percentage taken off the top of every paycheck, placed somewhere it could not be reached, and left completely alone for decades, while compound interest did the patient, invisible work. That is the entire discipline. It is so simple that it feels like it cannot possibly be the answer, and that simplicity is exactly why it stopped being taught. There is no product to sell in telling someone to save 10% and wait 30 years. There are enormous products to sell in telling them they can have everything now and sort out the cost later. The streetcar conductor in Pittsburgh did not have a financial advisor. He had a passbook, a percentage, and a promise he refused to break. Every week for 40 years, he paid himself first. And every week, the snowball got a little heavier, and somewhere in the middle of those 4 decades, the interest he earned began to outpace the deposits he made, and the thing started to grow on its own. He never saw it coming because he never looked. He just kept the promise. That was the whole strategy, and it built more quiet fortunes in this country than the stock market ever did. Your great-grandparents knew this. They practiced it so consistently that it became invisible to them. Just a thing you did, like locking the door at night. Then the culture changed. The institutions that protected the habit were dismantled, and a discipline that used to pass automatically from parent to child simply stopped being handed down. Now you know it too. The question is the same one it has always been. Will you pay yourself first this week, before anything else, and then keep doing it long enough for time to do its work? Try it for 1 paycheck. Take 10% off the top before you spend a dime of the rest, and put it somewhere you cannot reach. Then come back in a month and tell me whether your great-grandfather was wrong.